Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's, well, it's not just dominating headlines, it's actively reshaping global stability. We're talking about the intense escalation between Israel and Iran, the surprising direct involvement of the U.S., and these really perplexing claims of a ceasefire that seem to be maybe not quite
That's a
holding.
critical moment. Edward Jerejian from the Belfer Center really nailed it, calling the Middle East right now a critical crossroads.
Yeah, he talks about a unique opportunity for bold diplomacy, but at the same time, the status quo ante, the way things were.
It's just untenable.
Yeah,
He says it's a formula for continuing conflict. That's the core tension.
exactly. And what we've seen unfolding, especially since October 7th and the Gaza war, it's dramatically reshapes the whole region.
It really has. It's almost comparable in a way to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which, kind of surprisingly, eventually led to peace between Israel and Egypt. But the stakes today feel incredibly high. You've got significant U.S. national interests involved, and there's this desperate need for some kind of longer-term strategy,
Hmm.
to finally cool things down.
Right. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that noise. We've got a stack of sources here, academic analyses from the Belfer Center, Council on Foreign Relations,
Mm.
news reports from AP, the Economic Times, even some public commentary and intel speculation floating around on Reddit.
Yeah, see what people are saying on the ground, sort of.
Exactly. We want to pull out the key insights. We'll unpack the recent events, try to understand the different views on the conflict and the peace efforts, and look at the implications for the region and, well, for everyone. So let's dive in. Okay, maybe the best place to start to get a grip on this is this ambitious diplomatic idea that's been floated, the grand bargain. What exactly is that, and why now?
Well, it's more than just another peace plan, really. It's this audacious blueprint that tries to link everything together. Palestinian statehood, broader Arab normalization, and, crucially, managing Iran's nuclear program. The Belfer Center paper, you mentioned Jerejian, he basically proposes tackling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Iran's regional influence through one big diplomatic push.
One big package deal.
Pretty much. A series of major trade-offs, all aimed at lasting stability. So for Israel and the Palestinians, the idea is a newly elected Israeli government stops annexation policies, negotiates with new Palestinian leadership. The goal, a peace settlement. Ideally, they say, a two-state solution. That's seen as the best way to guarantee Israel stays democratic and Jewish.
And the U.S. role.
Ironclad security guarantees, that's the phrase used. And at the same time, the U.S. works with Arab countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, to normalize relations with Israel, building on the Abraham Accords, but within this bigger peace context.
Okay, that's already huge. So where does Iran fit into this grand vision?
Right, Iran. The approach is described as both credible pressure and credible engagement, which means Iran agrees, basically, not to get nuclear weapons
Right.
or the missiles to deliver them. The focus is on an unlimited time frame, no weaponization, strong inspections, but they could still pursue a civilian nuclear program under NPT safeguards.
Okay, what else for Iran?
They'd also have to support whatever the Palestinians and Israelis agree on, stop backing groups in the axis of resistance, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, that network, and just generally pursue friendly relations with neighbors.
And in return?
The U.S. ends sanctions, pledges no regime change, leaving that to Iranians themselves,
Yeah.
and starts dialogue, potentially leading to better relations, even diplomatic ties again.
Wow, it
Yeah.
really does sound incredibly ambitious, almost idealistic. What
Yeah.
makes anyone think this is even remotely possible right now?
Well, despite Iran's, regional goals and nuclear progress, Tehran is facing some serious problems at home, politically, economically, plus international isolation. Some analysts believe this pressure creates a window, maybe a narrow one, but a window for diplomacy.
A moment of leverage, perhaps.
Potentially. The Belfer paper really hammers home that strong U.S. leadership is essential, though. They argue it would boost U.S. credibility, strengthen alliances, help curb extremism, stabilize markets. There's that quote from an Arab Gulf leader, apparently. Both Israel and Iran are living by the sword while the rest of the region is striving to develop their societies.
Right, that cuts through it, suggests others in the region just want stability, want to move on.
Exactly. That desire for economic progress could be a powerful driver.
Okay, so while this grand bargain idea is out there, sort of hovering as a possibility, the reality on the ground has been, well, the opposite. Rapid, alarming military escalation.
Indeed. Things move fast. Over the past week, Israel reportedly conducted these systematic military operations against Iran. Sources suggest the goal was to basically eradicate Iran's air defenses, their offensive missile capabilities, and also hit their nuclear enrichment facilities.
And there were claims of Israeli air supremacy.
Yeah, because Iran's air fleet is apparently quite old, from the 70s and 80s, and their air defenses were seen as compromised. There were even reports, particularly circulating on places like Reddit, suggesting Israel was decapitating their military leadership.
Right.
And even a supposed Mossad operation to kill Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh inside Iran, smuggling a bomb in months ahead. Plus, the perception that the Axis of Resistance network was crumbling under the pressure.
Okay, that's already intense. But then the U.S. got directly involved. Walk us through that.
Right, that was the big shift. Early Sunday morning, the U.S. military directly struck 3 sites inside Iran. These weren't just any sites. They included key nuclear facilities,
Yeah.
Fordow, Natanz, Esfahan. And these were facilities reportedly under IAEA supervision.
Under international watch.
Exactly. The operation apparently involved B-2 stealth bombers. There were reports of over 30 tons of bombs dropped on Fordow alone. President Trump himself confirmed it, tweeted, Fordow is gone. A senior Israeli official called it a crushing blow to Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Wow. Gone. That's a very strong word. How do we even verify that? And what does gone really mean long-term for their nuclear program? We've seen setbacks before.
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Long-term impact is hard to gauge. As for the immediate aftermath, how did Iran respond to such a direct U.S. hit?
Yeah, what was a move?
They launched 14 missiles, aimed at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a major U.S. hub.
Okay, retaliation.
Yes, but here's the fascinating part. Sources indicate the U.S. got advance warning from Iran about the strike.
Advance warning? Why would they do that?
Well, it allowed Qatar to close its airspace, the base to be evacuated, planes moved. The interpretation is that Iran designed the attack to show strength, to reestablish deterrence, but simultaneously to prevent further escalation. They consciously limited the risk to U.S. personnel and assets.
So a calibrated response. Very different from their 2020 attack on Ain al-Assad base after Soleimani.
Exactly. A different calculation this time, it seems.
Okay, so these dramatic military actions, especially hitting nuclear sites, brings us right back to the core issue, Iran's nuclear program. What exactly is the status there, and what do these strikes really mean?
Well, the program has advanced significantly. They're enriching uranium up to 60%. That's really close to weapons grade. They have a stockpile, nearly 900 kilograms combined of 60% and 20% enriched uranium. And they've installed lots of advanced centrifuges, the kind banned under the old JCPOA deal.
So the capabilities there are
Yeah.
very close.
It's advanced. Now, experts, like those at the Arms Control Association, they emphasize that military strikes, they might set the program back, sure, but likely only temporarily. And there's a paradox here. They suggest these actions could actually increase the risk of Iran deciding to just go for broke, rebuild, maybe even weaponize, purely to deter future attacks, especially since they've been hardening and dispersing facilities.
Making them harder to hit comprehensively.
Right. And add to that, the IAEA hasn't been allowed into certain places like centrifuge workshops since 2021, so they can't fully vouch for where everything is.
So we don't have a complete picture.
Not entirely. And there's another risk. What if Iran, after being attacked, pulls out of Article X of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, especially if there's no hard proof they were weaponizing before the attack? Doing that could actually get them international sympathy, bizarrely, and make it harder to isolate them.
So if military action is just a temporary fix, maybe even counterproductive in the long run, what does that say about diplomacy, especially given the whole U.S. maximum pressure campaign we saw?
That's a critical point. That maximum pressure campaign, mostly economic sanctions. Most analyses from Human Rights Watch, Council on Foreign Relations, they say it largely failed. Minimum results, but caused huge economic pain for Iranians.
Right.
And Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, his takeaway seems to be that the only way to deter threats is increased strength, not concessions.
Which makes diplomacy incredibly difficult.
Exactly. How do you get a deal when one side feels strength is the only answer and sanctions just prove their point in their eyes? The Arms Control Association actually suggests Trump's instinct, to reject military strikes and focus on diplomacy is the right one. But they stress the U.S. needs realistic objectives. Move away from demanding complete dismantlement. Show Iran clearly how a deal benefits them.
A pragmatic approach.
And time's running out. That snapback mechanism for UN sanctions, the one the U.S. wants to work with Europe on, even after leaving the JCPOA, it expires in October 2025. The clock is ticking.
Okay, so amidst all this, escalation, nuclear worries, diplomatic dead ends, we get this really striking development, a declared ceasefire. But it seems confusing. What exactly was announced?
Yeah, confusing is a good word. On Sunday, President Trump announced what he called an historic Iran and Israel ceasefire agreement. Said it ended the 12-day war and would last forever. He credited Qatar with mediating.
Forever.
Yeah.
Okay. And the
Okay.
Economic Times reported it too.
Yes, they framed it as a testament to the power of diplomacy. Sounded quite definitive.
However, it seems not everyone got the memo. This is where it gets weird, right? What are the conflicting reports?
That's right. Almost immediately, you had reports from the New York Times, comments online, saying no official word yet from Israel or Iran on a ceasefire.
Nothing official from the main parties.
And then Iran itself came out and said it had received no offers for a ceasefire and wouldn't negotiate while its cities remain under attack from Israel.
So a flat denial from Iran.
Pretty much. And meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Guterres, he's expressing deep alarm, calling on all parties to stop fighting, which kind of implies there isn't actually a functioning ceasefire.
Right. If you have to call for fighting to stop. So what does this bizarre situation mean for international relations? How are other countries reacting when even the existence of a ceasefire is up for debate?
Reactions are all over the map, as you'd expect. Iran's foreign minister slammed the U.S. strikes, called them a grave violation of the UN Charter, international law, the NPT. Outrageous, said Iran reserves all options.
Strong words.
Venezuela, Cuba also condemned the U.S. Others, like China, the EU, called for de-escalation, negotiations. China specifically urged Israel towards a ceasefire. Saudi Arabia expressed deep concern, but interestingly didn't condemn the U.S. strikes, urged restraint.
Be careful lying there.
Whereas Australia,
Yeah.
they openly endorsed the U.S. strikes, said they support action to prevent Iran getting a nuclear weapon.
So a real split in reactions. What about domestically in the U.S.?
Clear political divide. Democrats, like Hakeem Jeffries, criticized Trump, risking entanglement, bypassing Congress. Republicans universally praise him. Peace through strength, decisive action. Very different takes.
Okay, stepping back a bit, this conflict isn't just about bombs and diplomacy. It has real-world economic and geopolitical consequences, right? What are some of the broader implications we should be aware of?
Absolutely. The economic costs are staggering, often get lost in the headlines. Estimates suggest just a month of war could cost Israel something like $12 billion. Daily military costs averaging $725 million. And remember, the Gaza war already cost Israel over $67.5 billion by late 2024. It's a massive drain.
And for Iran?
Even worse, arguably.
Yeah.
Over 80% of their population was already struggling with food insecurity before this latest round.
Yeah.
A prolonged conflict. Could be a national catastrophe, as one source put it.
Dire straits.
And then there's the risk of escalation into other domains. Cyber attacks are a big one. Iran retaliating against critical U.S. infrastructure, power grids, water, finance. The potential damages there could range from hundreds of billions up to over $1 trillion. It's a huge vulnerability.
Okay, so looking ahead, it feels like we're on a knife's edge. With the U.S. now directly involved, what are the potential ways this could play out? What are the scenarios people are considering?
Well, it's obviously shifted now with the direct U.S. strikes, but before that, T. Rowe Price had outlined 4 scenarios back in mid-June. The highest probability then was controlled confrontation, meaning continued attacks, but maybe winding down. No direct U.S. role, but still worried about Iran rebuilding its nuclear program.
That seems less likely now.
Probably. The next scenario was broader conflict involving the U.S., medium probability then. Triggered by attacks on U.S. assets or threats to energy, we seem to have crossed that bridge. Lower probability scenarios included Iran actually stepping back to restart nuclear talks, seen as tough because Israel might not have much incentive to deal with the current regime. And the last was complete regime collapse in Iran. Always hard to predict, and as they noted, doesn't automatically mean a pro-Western outcome. Could be chaos.
Right. Chaos isn't necessarily better.
And there's that perspective from responsible statecraft worth considering. They warn direct U.S. involvement risks an endless war. And they ask a really provocative question. Does Israel actually prefer the current Iranian regime, this kind of bête noire, this useful enemy?
Why would they?
Because, the argument goes, it deflects attention from Israel's own actions, helps maintain its regional nuclear monopoly. Maybe they prefer that to a stable, moderate, but still potentially rivalrous Iran? Or even worse, a chaotic Libya-type situation. It's a sobering thought.
It really is. We've covered a huge amount today. From that ambitious, maybe idealistic, grand bargain idea
Right.
to the intense military actions between Israel, Iran, and now the U.S., and this utterly baffling situation with the supposed ceasefire.
Yeah. What's crystal clear, I think, is just how volatile the region is. This constant tension between trying military pressure versus diplomatic paths, and all the key players have such complex, often conflicting motivations. It makes predicting anything incredibly difficult.
We've seen the debate about whether military strikes on nuclear programs even work long term.
Exactly. And that lasting peace seems to require this mutual strategic interest
Hmm.
and just limiting yourself,
Hmm.
pulling back.
Hmm.
And that seems pretty rare right now.
So for you, our listener, what's the takeaway here? Maybe it's just how fragile peace really is. It's not an on-off switch. It's this contested space where even the word ceasefire becomes part of the conflict.
Hmm.
And maybe it's worth thinking about that balance,
Yeah.
between the perfect grand solution and the possible reality, these messy incremental steps. What actually happens when a ceasefire itself is disputed by the very people it's supposed to bind? And how do these shifts in power, military and economic, really shape what's possible next in such a vital part of the world? Definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel a little more informed, maybe a bit more curious about this incredibly complex situation unfolding in the Middle East.